I spent 40 years as my family's unpaid servant, so I sent them a 40-pound box of inheritance that turned them into bitter enemies. Stay tuned to see the moment they opened it, and found the one thing they never expected. The humidity in the valley was thick enough to swallow a man whole, but at 65 years old, I was still the one standing on a ladder against my sister Sarah's gutters. My knees didn't just ache anymore, they felt like they were filled with ground glass. Every time I reached for a clump of wet leaves and rotting pine needles, a sharp spark of pain traveled from my lower back to the base of my skull. I looked down. Below me, Sarah was holding a glass of iced tea, leaning against her pristine white porch railing. She wasn't holding the ladder. She was looking at her phone. "You're almost done, right, Arthur?" she called up, not even looking at the sweat dripping off my chin. "Because the caterers for the garden club are coming at 4, and I really need the driveway cleared of all that muck you're pulling out." "No, how are you feeling?" "No, do you need a break?" Just a reminder that my labor, my free, grueling labor, was an inconvenience to her social schedule. This was my life. For 40 years, I had been the family's Swiss Army knife. If something broke, Arthur fixed it. If someone needed a ride to the airport at 3 in the morning, Arthur's sedan was idling in the driveway. If a tax form looked too complicated, it ended up on my kitchen table. Growing up, our parents had drilled it into us: family takes care of family. But as the years turned into decades, the definition of family started to shrink until it only included the people who needed things from me. My brother, Steve, was 5 years younger and lived his life like a permanent vacation. He had a career in real estate that mostly involved playing golf and waiting for commissions that rarely came. When he bought a fixer-upper he couldn't afford to fix, he didn't hire a crew. He called me. I spent 6 months of my weekends tiling his floors and painting his crown molding while he sat in the next room watching sports. When he finally sold that house for a massive profit, did he offer me a cut? No. He bought a boat. A boat that I, eventually, had to learn how to winterize because he couldn't figure out the manual. Sarah was no better. She viewed my retirement not as a hard-earned rest, but as a promotion to full-time family assistant. To them, my time had zero value because I didn't charge for it. In their minds, because I was a bachelor and a handy guy, I didn't have a life of my own. My hobbies, my rest, my own home, all of it was secondary to their latest crisis. The true rot was revealed 2 months after our father passed away. We were sitting in his old study, a room that smelled of stale pipe tobacco and yellowing paper. This should have been a time of grieving, of sharing memories of the man who raised us. Instead, it was a Shark Tank. Our father had been a quiet man, a collector of oddities. He wasn't wealthy in the traditional sense, but the family legend of the hidden hoard had loomed over our childhoods. Grandfather had been a jeweler in the Great Depression, and the story went that he had converted his entire wealth into rare gold coins and high-carat stones, hidden somewhere in the family estate to keep it safe from the banks. Steve was leaning back in Dad's leather chair, acting like he already owned the place. "Look," he said, tapping a pen on the desk. "We all know the gold is real. Dad mentioned it in '08 when the market crashed. He said he wasn't worried because he had a safety net under his feet." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes bright with a hunger I hadn't seen before. "If it's in this house, we need to find it before we list the property. Arthur, you know the bones of this place better than anyone. You spent all that time fixing the foundation and the attic vents last summer. I looked at them. They didn't want to help. They wanted me to be the bird dog. "I'm 65, Steve," I said quietly. "My back is shot from the gutters last week. I was hoping we could just hire a professional organizer to go through the house." The room went silent. Steve laughed, a dry, condescending sound. "A professional? And pay them 15%? Come on, Artie. You're retired. You've got nothing but time. Besides, we trust you. We don't trust a stranger." Trust was the word they used when they wanted to bypass a paycheck. The dinner ended with them assigning me the task of clearing out the attic. They didn't offer to bring over boxes. They didn't offer to help carry the heavy furniture. They simply decided that Arthur would do it, and they would return on Sunday to review what I had found. As I watched them drive away in their luxury SUVs, bought with money they never spent on repairs because I did them for free, I stood in the driveway of my childhood home. My hands were calloused, my joints were throbbing, and my heart was cold. I realized then that if I died tomorrow, they wouldn't cry because they missed my company. They would cry because the pipes in their houses would eventually leak, and they wouldn't know who to call to fix them for free. I walked back into the house and looked up at the attic pull-down stairs. I wasn't going to be their laborer anymore. If they wanted a treasure hunt, I was going to give them one. But the treasure wouldn't be gold. It would be the mirror I was about to hold up to their faces. The plan formed in the silence of that empty house. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted, a heavy box, a family secret, and a reason to show their true colors. I climbed the stairs into the dark, dusty attic, not as a servant, but as the architect of their undoing. The attic of my father's house was a graveyard of memories, a place where the air was thick with the scent of cedar, mothballs, and 40 years of accumulated dust. For 3 days, I lived up there. I didn't mind the heat or the cramped quarters. For the first time in my life, I wasn't working for my siblings. I was working for myself. The family gold was the carrot they had been chasing their entire lives. It was the reason Steve never saved a dime and the reason Sarah lived beyond her means. They both believed a magical windfall was waiting to bail them out of their own poor decisions. As I sifted through old trunks and crates, I realized the gold was a myth. My father hadn't been a secret millionaire, he was a man who liked the idea of being one. I found old ledger books, but they weren't filled with accounts of bullion. They were filled with failed investments and grocery receipts from 1984. But then, tucked behind a chimney flue, I found the perfect props, a stack of vintage, velvet-lined jewelry boxes. They were empty, but they looked expensive. I also found my grandfather's old iron-bound chest. It was small, incredibly heavy when empty, and had a lock that looked like it guarded the crown jewels. I sat on a milk crate and looked at that chest. This was it. This was the vessel for their greed that I knew my siblings. They weren't just greedy, they were observant in the worst ways. If I sent a box that felt like it was full of air, they'd know it was a prank. To catch a shark, the bait has to look and feel real. I went down to my own garage, the workshop where I had spent thousands of hours fixing their broken lamps and power tools. I gathered 40 pounds of the most worthless material I owned. I used rusted window sash weights from a 1920s remodel, broken cast iron pipe sections, and several heavy paving bricks. I wrapped each brick and piece of scrap metal in thick bubble wrap. I didn't want the box to clank. I wanted it to have that thud that suggested dense, valuable weight, the kind of weight gold has. I placed the empty, velvet-lined jewelry boxes on top of the scrap metal so that if anyone managed to peek through a seam, they'd see the glimmer of silk and the promise of wealth. At the very center of the box, I placed a single, cream-colored envelope. Inside was nothing but a blank sheet of paper for now, but in my mind, it was already the most powerful document I had ever written. Creating the box was only half the battle. I had to prime the pump. I had to make sure their paranoia was running at full tilt before the package even touched their doorsteps. On Wednesday morning, I sent the group text. I made sure to sound exhausted, as if the discovery had physically drained me. I found it. It was hidden behind the false wall in the attic. It's heavy, heavier than the stories said. I've secured it in a shipping crate. I'm too tired to deal with the bickering right now. I'm sending it to Steve's house because he has the alarm system, but it's addressed to both of you. Do not open it until I get there Sunday. It needs to be a family moment. The bait was taken instantly. My phone didn't just ring, it screamed. Steve called first. Artie, is it the coins? Tell me it's the double eagles. How big is the box? Is it insured? I told him I couldn't talk, that I was scared of the responsibility of holding on to it. That was the magic phrase. It suggested the value was so high it was dangerous. Then came Sarah. She didn't ask about the gold. She asked about Steve. Why are you sending it to his house? You know he's underwater on his mortgage, Arthur. He's going to skim off the top. He's going to weigh the coins and swap them for fakes. Send it to me instead. I sighed into the phone, sounding like the defeated brother they thought I was. I already paid for the courier, Sarah. Just keep an eye on him. I'm sure he'll be honest. By sowing that tiny seed of doubt, I'm sure he'll be honest. I had essentially told her that he wouldn't be, that I didn't just mail the box. I turned the act of shipping into a theatrical performance. I went to the local shipping center where I knew the clerk, a talkative woman named Betty. I made sure to struggle with the box as I hauled it onto the counter. Heavy one today, Arthur, she asked. The most important thing I've ever shipped, Betty, I said, loud enough for the 3 people behind me to hear. I need this tract, insured for the maximum allowed, and I need a restricted signature. Only Stephen Miller can sign for it, but Sarah Miller has to be present to witness the delivery. I knew the clerk would remember this. I knew that if things went to court, which my siblings often threatened over the smallest things, there would be a paper trail of my diligence. As I walked out of the post office, I looked at my hands. They were shaking, but not from age. They were shaking with the thrill of the hunt. For 40 years, I had been the one being used. Now, I was the one pulling the strings. I had turned their own greed into a clockwork orange, and I was about to watch it unravel. I drove home, poured myself a glass of bourbon, and turned my phone on silent. I knew that at Steve's house and Sarah's house, the peace was already over. The box hadn't even arrived yet, and already, they were imagining their new lives, lives built on a foundation of rusted iron and old bricks. The trap was set, and the beauty of it was that they were the ones who would spring it on themselves. The box arrived at Steve's suburban McMansion on a Tuesday afternoon. I knew the exact moment it touched his porch because I received a notification from the tracking service, and exactly 45 seconds later, my phone began to vibrate so violently it nearly hummed off my kitchen counter. Steve didn't lead with a hello. He led with a gasp. "Artie, the courier just left. I had to help him with the dolly. This thing, it's like a lead weight. I tried to lift it to put it on the workbench in the garage, and I nearly threw my back out. Are you sure you didn't find the actual mint? What's in here?" I kept my voice low, tired, and intentionally vague. "I told you, Steve. It's everything. The coins, the ledgers, the jewelry boxes. I didn't count it. I was too overwhelmed. Just, keep it safe. Remember, Sarah has to be there when the seal is broken." That was the agreement. There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear Steve's heavy breathing. "Yeah," he finally said, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "But Sarah didn't find it. You did. And I'm the one guarding it. Doesn't it seem a bit unfair that she gets an equal share when she hasn't even stepped foot in the attic?" The hook was set. Steve was already mentally spending money that didn't exist, and his first instinct wasn't gratitude, it was exclusion. An hour later, Sarah called. She wasn't whispering, she was hysterical. "He won't let me in the garage, Arthur." I drove over there the second I saw the delivered notification, and Steve had the garage door shut and the side entry locked. He told me through the window that he was securing the perimeter. "He's going to open it, isn't he? He's in there right now with a crowbar, taking the best pieces." "Sarah, calm down," I said, suppressing a smile. "Steve wouldn't do that. He knows it's a legal estate matter. He's probably just worried about security. Why don't you just go home and wait for Sunday?" "Wait for Sunday? While he's in there with our inheritance," she shrieked. "I'm calling my lawyer. I'm serious. If one coin is missing, I'm suing him into the next century." This was the beauty of the plan. I didn't have to lie to them, I just had to defend them to each other. By defending Steve to Sarah, I convinced her he was guilty. By defending Sarah's rights to Steve, I convinced him she was a threat. For the next 48 hours, my siblings engaged in a cold war that would have made a world leader blush. Through a series of frantic texts and check-in calls, I pieced together the scene at Steve's house. Sarah had decided she couldn't trust Steve to be alone with the box. She had parked her SUV at the end of his driveway and refused to leave. She brought a thermos of coffee and a blanket, sitting there like a sentry. Steve, meanwhile, had grown so paranoid that he had moved his home office into the garage. He was sleeping on a cot next to a cardboard box filled with bricks and rusted scrap metal. They were both prisoners. Steve was a prisoner of his wealth, and Sarah was a prisoner of her envy. I, on the other hand, was having the most relaxing week of my life. For the first time in decades, no one asked me to fix a leaky faucet. No one asked me to drive them to the pharmacy. They were too busy guarding a box of junk to bother the man who had spent 40 years being their servant. By Thursday, the paranoia had turned into a full-blown fever. Steve called me, sounding frantic. "Artie, you have to tell Sarah to back off. She's out there with a notebook, recording every time I open the garage door to let the dog out. She thinks I'm smuggling gold out in the dog's collar. It's insane. And I've been thinking. You said there were ledgers in the box. What if Dad left a note saying I should get more? I was the one who helped him move that one time in '94, remember? I deserve a management fee for storing this stuff. I leaned back in my recliner, sipping a tea I finally had time to enjoy. I don't know, Steve. The paperwork in the envelope is pretty specific. I think it lays out exactly what everyone is owed. But hey, if you feel you deserve more, maybe you should look for the extra yourself. I knew exactly what that would trigger. I hadn't taped the box with standard tape, I had used a specific, patterned duct tape and marked the seams with a fine point Sharpie. If Steve tried to peek, he'd never be able to align the marks perfectly again. I was counting on him trying. The breaking point came Friday night. Sarah sent a group text that simply read, "I saw the light on in the garage at 3 a.m. The tape on the left side looks wrinkled. I've taken photos. Steve, you have 4 hours to let me inspect the seals, or I'm calling the police to report a theft from the estate." Steve's reply was a string of profanities that would have made our mother faint. They were no longer a family. They were two predators fighting over a carcass. And the best part? The carcass was made of paving stones. As I sat in my quiet house, I realized that the free labor they had stolen from me over the years was finally being repaid. The cost of my silence was their sanity. They were losing sleep, losing hair, and losing their relationship with each other, all for the sake of a box that contained nothing but the physical weight of their own greed. I spent Friday evening packing my own bags. Not for a treasure hunt, but for a one-way trip to a small rental cottage by the sea I'd secretly booked months ago. The stage was set for Sunday. The box was in place, the villains were primed, and the invisible son was about to make his final, grand exit. I went to bed that night and slept for 10 hours straight. In the distance, 40 miles away, I knew my brother was staring at a pile of bricks, convinced he was looking at a fortune, while my sister sat in the dark, convinced her brother was a thief. It was the most honest they had been with each other in years. By Saturday evening, the atmosphere at Steve's house had shifted from mere suspicion to a tactical standoff. I drove by the house just once, partly to check the progress, and partly to enjoy the fruits of my design. It was a sight to behold. Sarah's car was still parked at the curb, but she had upgraded her vigil. She was sitting in a lawn chair on the sidewalk, a thermos in one hand and her phone in the other, glaring at Steve's darkened windows. Inside that house, I knew Steve was a wreck. He hadn't showered in 3 days. He was convinced that the 40 pounds of gold in his garage was the only thing standing between him and his mounting debts. The weight of the box had become a physical manifestation of his desperation. The long knives didn't come out all at once. It started with a series of frantic, vitriolic text messages that I watched pop up on my screen like flares over a battlefield. Sarah, 6:14 p.m. I see you, Steve. I see you moving around in there. If you open that envelope without me, I'm filing for a restraining order and an emergency injunction on the estate. Steve, 6:22 p.m. Get off my property, you vulture. You haven't checked on Dad in 6 months, and now you're camping on the sidewalk for money you didn't earn. Artie sent it to me. That means I'm the executor. They were already stripping away the veneer of family. They weren't brother and sister anymore, they were litigants. The true explosion happened at 8 p.m. Sarah, pushed to the brink by Steve's refusal to let her inspect the seals on the box, decided to take matters into her own hands. She didn't call the police, she called a mobile locksmith. I know this because Steve called me, his voice hitting a pitch I hadn't heard since he was 6 years old. "Artie. You won't believe this. She brought a guy. She's trying to have him pick the lock on my side garage door. I'm standing here with a baseball bat, Arthur. Tell her to stop before someone gets hurt." "Steve, put the bat down," I said, my voice as smooth as glass. "She's just anxious. You have to understand, from her perspective, you're hiding the family's future in a garage. Just let her see the box. Don't open it, just let her see the tape." "No," Steve roared. "If I let her in, she'll never leave. She'll try to drag it to her car. I know how she is. She thinks she's the responsible one, just because she has a Lexus and a membership to the country club." In the background, I could hear the muffled sound of Sarah shouting at the locksmith to just do the job. I could hear the locksmith's confused voice saying he didn't want to get involved in a domestic dispute. The neighborhood, usually a quiet enclave of manicured lawns, was now the stage for a Miller family meltdown. The locksmith eventually fled, sensing the legal nightmare brewing, but the damage was done. Sarah didn't leave. She marched up to the garage door and began pounding on it with her fists. Steve opened the small window in the door, and the two of them began a shouting match that lasted for nearly 2 hours. They weren't just talking about the box anymore. That was the most fascinating part. The box was just the key that unlocked 40 years of resentment. "You always were Dad's favorite," Sarah screamed through the wood. "He gave you the down payment for your first house, and you never paid him back. You're a thief, Stephen. You've been stealing from this family since the 80s. "Me?" Steve yelled back. "You're the one who borrowed Mom's jewelry after the funeral and forgot to put it back in the safety deposit box. You're a hypocrite. And what about Arthur? You've treated him like a janitor for 20 years. You think I don't see it? You call him to fix your toilets so you don't have to pay a plumber. Oh, like you're any better," Sarah countered. "You had him painting your deck while you were at the Masters. You both use him." It was the first time they had acknowledged the truth, that they were both users. But they didn't say it with shame. They used it as ammunition against each other. They were weaponizing my labor to prove who was the worst sibling. As the night wore on, the insults got deeper and more personal. They brought up failed marriages, children who didn't call, and the various ways they had disappointed our parents. The family gold had acted like a chemical agent, dissolving the bond that had kept them civil at Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas mornings. I sat in my dark living room, listening to the play-by-play through their angry phone calls to me. Every time Steve called to complain about Sarah, I'd say, "I'm sure she doesn't mean it, Steve. She's just stressed." And every time Sarah called to scream about Steve, I'd say, "He's just protective, Sarah. He knows how much is at stake." I was the peacemaker, who was actually feeding the fire. By Saturday at midnight, they had reached a state of total exhaustion and mutual hatred. They agreed on one thing: they would wait until Sunday morning, but they would do it together. Sarah moved her lawn chair into the garage. Steve sat on his cot. They spent the night in a cold, silent garage, staring at a cardboard box filled with 40 pounds of garbage. While they sat in that garage, surrounded by the ghosts of their greed, I was finishing my own preparations. I had already loaded my car. My house was clean. The keys were on the counter for the real estate agent who would be listing it on Monday. I looked at the old family photos one last time. I felt a flicker of sadness, but it was quickly replaced by a profound sense of relief. For 65 years, I had carried the weight of their expectations, their laziness, and their entitlement. Tomorrow, I was going to hand that weight back to them, literally and figuratively. The night of the long knives had done exactly what I hoped it would. It had stripped away the lie of their closeness. It had shown them that without me to buffer their egos and fix their problems, they had nothing but contempt for one another. I went to sleep that night knowing that the sun would rise on the last day I would ever have to be Arthur the Reliable. Tomorrow, the box would be opened, the truth would be revealed, and I would finally be free. I didn't need gold to be rich. I just needed to be gone. Sunday morning arrived with a cruel, bright clarity. The sun was hitting the pavement of Steve's driveway with a relentless glare, highlighting every crack in the concrete, cracks I had once offered to seal for him, only to be told he was too busy to buy the supplies. I pulled up to the house at precisely 9 a.m. I didn't rush. I dressed in my best linen shirt, looking more like a man going on a cruise than a man attending a family estate meeting. As I stepped out of the car, the silence in the neighborhood was heavy. It was the kind of silence that follows a hurricane. Steve and Sarah were already waiting in the garage. They looked terrible. Steve's eyes were bloodshot, his polo shirt wrinkled and stained with coffee. Sarah looked like she had aged 5 years in a single week, her hair was unkempt, and she held her designer handbag against her chest like a shield. They weren't looking at each other. They were both staring at the box, which sat on a plastic folding table in the center of the garage like an altar. "You're late," Steve croaked. His voice was raw from the shouting matches of the night before. "I'm right on time," I said softly. "The air feels different today, doesn't it?" I walked to the table. The patterned duct tape I had used was slightly misaligned on the left corner. Steve had clearly tried to peel it back in the middle of the night but had lost his nerve when he realized he couldn't hide the evidence. I didn't mention it. I just pulled a pocketknife from my slacks. "Before we open this," I said, looking from Sarah to Steve, "I want you both to remember something. You've spent the last 6 days talking about what you deserve. You've talked about Dad's legacy, the family gold, and how much this inheritance will change your lives. But has either of you thought about what this box actually represents? Just open it, Arthur," Sarah snapped, her foot tapping a rapid, nervous rhythm on the concrete. "We've been through hell this week. We've earned whatever is in there." I nodded. "You're right. You certainly worked hard this week." I slid the blade through the tape. The sound of the cardboard being sliced seemed to echo like a gunshot. I pulled the flaps back slowly. Steve was the first to reach in. His hands were shaking so violently he nearly tripped. He shoved aside the top layer of packing paper, his eyes wide, expecting the dull glint of gold bullion or the sparkle of loose diamonds. Instead, his hand met the cold, rough surface of a Chicago-style paving brick. He pulled it out, staring at it with a look of utter incomprehension. What is this? Is it hidden inside the brick? Is this a joke?" Sarah pushed him aside, her manicured nails digging into the box. She pulled out a rusted iron window weight. Then a section of corroded copper pipe. Then another brick. She began throwing them onto the garage floor. Thud. Clang. Thud. The sounds of my free labor were literally hitting the ground at their feet. "Where is it?" she screamed, turning on me, her face contorted with a mixture of rage and grief. "Where is the gold, Arthur? You stole it. You found it in the attic and you replaced it with this trash." Steve gripped my collar, his face inches from mine. "You son of a bitch. We spent a week guarding bricks. We nearly killed each other over a box of scrap metal. Tell us where the real inheritance is." I didn't flinch. I didn't even raise my voice. I simply reached into the very bottom of the box and pulled out the cream-colored envelope. I handed it to Sarah. "The inheritance is in there," I said. She snatched it and ripped it open. Steve hovered over her shoulder. They expected a map, a key to a safe deposit box, or a secret bank account number. What they found was a 3-page document, meticulously typed and formatted. At the top, it read, "Invoice for services rendered, 1986 to 2026. Sarah began to read aloud, her voice trembling. "June 1994, re-roofing Sarah's garage. Materials, paid by Arthur. Labor, 48 hours. Market value, $4,500. Charge, $0. August 2002, emergency plumbing and basement restoration for Steve. Labor, 72 hours. Market value, $6,000. Charge, $0. January 2010, full tax preparation and audit defense for Miller Estates. Market value, $12,000. Charge, $0. Page after page, I had listed every major project, every midnight rescue, every favor they had demanded of me for 4 decades. I had researched the market rates for every single task. At the bottom of the final page, there was a grand total in bold, red ink, $482,500. Below that, I had typed a final note. "For 40 years, I was your free labor. You viewed my time as worthless because I was family. This box contains the physical weight of that labor, the bricks I laid, the pipes I fixed, the scrap I hauled. The gold you were looking for was the $500,000 in services I gave you for free, which you used to fund your vacations, your cars, and your greed. Since you've already spent your inheritance, I consider the debt settled. Do not contact me again. I am retiring from this family." The silence that followed was different than the one that started the morning. It wasn't the silence of a hurricane, it was the silence of a vacuum. Steve let go of my collar. He looked at the pile of rusted iron at his feet, then back at the invoice. He looked like a man who had been told the air he was breathing was actually poison. Sarah dropped the paper. It fluttered down and landed on a pile of dusty bricks. "You can't do this," she whispered. "We're family." "We were a business," I corrected her, "where I was the only employee and you were the only shareholders. But the company just went bankrupt." I turned and walked toward my car. "Arthur!" Steve yelled, stumbling out of the garage. "Arthur, wait. The house, we still have to sell the house. Who's going to prep it for the inspectors? The HVAC is making that clicking sound again." I didn't even look back. I got into my car, started the engine, and felt a surge of adrenaline that made me feel 25 again. As I pulled out of the driveway, I saw them in the rearview mirror, 2 middle-aged people standing in a garage full of junk, surrounded by the wreckage of their own greed, realizing for the first time that the reliable one was gone. That I drove for 6 hours. I didn't listen to the radio, I listened to the sound of the wind. I had already changed my phone number. I had already transferred my bank accounts. When I reached the coast, the air smelled of salt and possibility. I walked into my small, rented cottage and sat on the deck overlooking the ocean. My back still ached, and my knees were still shot, but the weight was gone. People often ask why I didn't just say no all those years ago. They don't understand that some traps are built slowly, brick by brick. But I had used those same bricks to build my exit. My siblings didn't lose a fortune that day. They never had one. What they lost was the only person who truly cared for them without a price tag. And as for me, I didn't need the family gold. I had something much more valuable. I had the rest of my life, and for the first time, it belonged entirely to me.